Hi there, everybody. So this is just a short little video for our class for May the 4th. The purpose of this video is only meant to sort of kick off our discussion for the class. So two things to keep in mind in that regard is that this is not meant to be in any way a comprehensive lecture or analysis. This is just some brief, quick thoughts. And we're barely even scratching the surface in this video. The main point of me making this video is just to help you generate some thoughts and maybe set off some analytical sparks in your mind, some fuel for interpretation of these poems by Lorca and Langston Hughes. The other thing to keep in mind is that these poems should by no means be limited to any one reading or any one particular aspect. Federico Garcia Lorca and Langston Hughes are both very complex poets in their own different ways. They're very different poets, but there's some overlap in their thinking, I would argue, and their themes and their intentions, their beliefs. But as artists, they are very different kinds of artists. So for this video, I just want to look at one of the poems by Lorca, just to kind of actually just read through it and try to offer some commentary and as we go through it. And again, because this video is not meant to be a full lecture of any kind or a full analysis, but merely just a way to stimulate discussion, I would try to move through it pretty quick and keep this video pretty brief. And then I want to look at one small passage from the Langston Hughes poem, Let America Be America Again. So to kick it off, I will set up my screen so you see my screen. And we will look at the landscape of the vomiting crowd, Lorca first. Again, just reading through it and offering up some commentary, some food for thought, I hope, and some stimulus for richer, fuller discussion, as limited as the time is that we have to actually engage in that collectively. So with no further ado, all right, so again, this is just a quick reading with some commentary. So we have landscape of the vomiting crowd, twilight at Coney Island. The fat woman came in front, tearing up roots and wetting the skins of drums. So this is the first bit. I want to offer one possible interpretation of this fat woman figure as a kind of symbol of the economy, bearing in mind that Lorca is writing these poems in the midst of complete economic collapse in America and the world over, really. An economy that has fallen from, the roaring 20s, rich and vital times, constantly inflating and then taking a sudden plummet. So in that way, if we consider the fat woman as this sort of robust, swelling over figure, full of a figure made large by consumption, shall we say, to put it simply. The fat woman who turns agonizing octopi inside out. So this an octopi that comes in. I would argue that as much as anything, that is just one of those surrealist sprinkles put into the poem. You can find other meaning in it, but I think on the most forward point of that agonizing octopi is just to kind of shock and confuse a little bit, to stun, to create a dream sensation. Uh, and that has many things. We can follow these symbols into our own sort of naked unconscious. Um, it reminds us that this isn't a dissertation. This isn't an instruction manual. This is a piece of poetry of art, which means that it doesn't have one direct meaning. It can be open to different meanings, and the reader has an opportunity to kind of pause here and sort of consider that language isn't working here on a practical everyday level. The language is being heightened out of the everyday. It's being heightened out of the real. This is surreal. This is the language is figurative. Um, and then we have the fat woman, enemy of the moon, ran through the streets and empty apartments, and left in the corners small pigeon skulls, and raised the furies of last century's banquets, and called on the demon of bread through the hills of the barren sky, and filtered a hunger for light in the underground traffic. So we're continuing on with the fat one. The enemy of the moon. That the moon is a constant symbol throughout these three poems, and if we consider the moon as sort of synonymous with dreams, perhaps even the American dream, uh, then there's this sort of contrast here. There's this sort of contradiction. If this figure of, if we take it for granted that she is a sort of economical symbol, let's say, a figure of robustness, um, of richness, of fullness, and if we hold up the moon as a symbol of dreams, let's say the American dream, just because that is the theme of this class, but I think it's an extremely valid way to read this poem. Why should a figure of richness be a symbol of the American dream? And I think that can be very easily tied into the depression that has just ensued. Um, the idea of inflation, of the illusion that extreme wealth can create of possibilities for the masses. Ultimately, not everybody in a capitalist society can be excessively rich without the bubble bursting. So we have small pigeon skulls in the corners. Again, I think that's a little bit of a surreal touch, that she's eating these pigeons and leaving them inside of empty apartments. But it also creates this feeling of liberty for the fat woman, in a sense. Not liberty in a moral sense, but just in a concrete sense of freely moving throughout different sectors of the environment, basically through streets and the apartments. It's she is ubiquitous in a way. She is everywhere. The demon of bread. One way to think of that, perhaps, is as the the constant need to be haunted and possessed by a constant need, which is hunger. Through the hills of the barren sky. So the barren sky, barren, hungry, scarcity. One would never be so haunted by the idea of food as one who cannot get food. The starving person is, in a sense, haunted by the demon of bread. Here, and then there's this phrase, and filtered a hunger for light in the underground traffic. So again, we have this notion of hunger, this kind of underground traffic. There's a lot of different ways you can read that. This kind of the seething underbelly, the seething wants, the seething desires. You might think of that as the unconscious, perhaps even hungering for, sort of suppressed desires. A lot of different ways to read that. But these are the graveyards, I know it. These are the graveyards and the sadness of kitchens buried under sand. These are the dead, the pheasants and the apples of another hour pushing through our throats. So we have very rich symbolism here, almost overwhelming at times. These are the graveyards, I know it, these are the graveyards. So we can sort of see this as a graveyard, a place of death of death from the dream, or if the pursuit of, let's say, the American dream qualifies as analogous to life, then once one becomes disillusioned from that pursuit, from that possibility, then one is in a sense dead. That does not necessarily mean that one cannot be reborn and in a mental, in a moral, spiritual sense of some kind. But the identity of a person might be said to die when that person becomes disillusioned with the dream that gave shape to their identity. When that dream dies, and the identity that was defined by that dream can also be said to die in a sense. And the sadness of kitchens buried under sand. Kitchens still having to do with hunger, but a kitchen buried under sand, of course, is not really a functional kitchen. The apples of an hour being, you can think of that almost as, one way to think of it is as a memory of another time, a time when one was not hungry, whether in a very concrete sense of hunger or a spiritual hunger, a moral hunger, a hunger for happiness, hunger, or the fulfillment of hunger being a kind of the fulfillment of hunger, a feast, a banquet, anything like that, is generally going to be aligned with feelings of happiness, of joy, of celebration. So anything with food, the apples of another time, apples being food, pushing through our throats, it's not in the present. The present that is happening is a time of hunger. It's a barren time, a time of haunting, of being haunted by needs and wants, which we can start to wonder about here. So we've started off with this figure of robustness, and then we have people starving, or images of starvation, of death. And yet this is at Coney Island, which is supposed to be, dreamland. It's an amusement park. It's supposed to be a happy place. So there's a kind of contradiction here of the dream that is taking place within this setting. The rumbling came from the jungle of vomit, with empty women, with children of hot wax, with fermented trees and tireless waiters who serve dishes of salt under harps of saliva. No cure, my son, so vomit. There is no cure. It isn't the vomit of the horsemen on the breasts of whores, or the vomit of the cat that swallows a frog by mistake. These are the dead who claw with earthen hands the doors of flint where clouds and sweets are rotting. Uh, so one thing to ask here is what exactly is being vomited, and Coney Island. There's a lot of in a very real sense. One would one can easily associate vomit with Coney Island, and that again. So this is just on the real level. People get on rides, they get sick. They're gluttonizing on carnival food, on hot dogs and popcorn and beer and what have you, and then they get on these rides, they throw up, and that could be kind of a realistic reading of it, but obviously because we have mentions of agonized octopi up above and so on and so forth, and all this extremely strange imagery, we know that this isn't a realistic poem. The language is meant to be figurative more than realistic. So we might ask, what does the vomit imply here? And if we continue on with this reading, that the fat woman is an economical symbol. If we want to follow that thread and maintain that analysis throughout, then perhaps what he's referring to with the vomit, what's being explosively poured out from the people, is money. That's one way to codify this poem, as it were, is to find to read it in an economic structure. Lorca, of course, I don't think he's so simple as that. But again, this is just one way to interpret this, and one way to set it up, and to begin to get even deeper into it. We're barely scratching the iceberg here. So, to be clear, that to read all of these as economic symbols doesn't mean that it should just stop there. But I'm just trying to set up this jumping off point of relating it to the Great Depression, basically. So we're in the happy dreamland where people are vomiting out their money. Children of hot wax. We have these surrealist touches. You can maybe read into it more, and I think you should read into it more. But the immediate reading of it, at least, is just that it's weird, to put it bluntly. It's almost nightmarish in a way. And I think that some of Lorca's poems, some of them are frightening, just as on an emotive level. Before even analyzing them, they sort of operate as nightmares in a way. Some of them, but then there's also brighter spots. So no cure, my son, so vomit. So one might read this as Lorca sort of shouting out to the world, you're going to be disillusioned. There's this dream, that there's ambition, there's upward striving, but there's really no cure. You're going to be disillusioned, and in that sense, it's inevitable that you are going to sort of die, in a sense. Again, not in a practical sense, but in a kind of spiritual, moral sense. One might read this as Lorca saying that that's sort of inevitable, but sort of saying it ironically, sarcastically, because if he's saying so vomit, then it's almost like he's saying, all right, so you're bound to your identity is bound to be destructed. So screw it, spend everything, just go crazy, vomit it out, get rid of it. It doesn't matter. And then we have more of these surrealist nightmare touches, the breasts of horrors. The vomit. It isn't the vomit of the horseman on the breasts of whores, or the vomit of the cat that swallows a frog by mistake. These are the dead who claw with earthen hands, the doors of flint where clouds and sweets are rotting. The fat woman came in front, with the people from the ships, the bars and gardens. The vomit delicately beat its drums among some girls of blood who sought protection of the moon. So again, if we maintain the fat woman as this figure of robustness, as a kind of illusory fulfillment of the dream, we can read this as she's leading the people. This symbol is leading the people into this situation of vomit, of decay. The vomit delicately beat its drums among some girls of the moon, of blood who sought protection of the moon. So again, we have this sort of, you know, seeking protection of the dream, of the illusion, but there is no protection. They too are sort of touched by this, the desecration that comes with the vomit. Ay de me, this look of mine was mine, but then was mine no more. This look that trembles naked in alcohol and sees off incredible ships through the anemones of the docks. So again, if we this look of mine being this kind of identity, the identity born of following the dream, of ambition, of everything that one might be working for in life or believing in, but then was mine no more. The look that trembles naked in alcohol and sees off incredible ships through the anemones of the docks. So we have this sort of stripped away rawness that comes with, well, naked in alcohol. I think it's kind of like when one is becoming real with oneself and sort of staring into the metaphorical mirror, as it were, without any pretense, without any surface distractions. And then, of course, this look of mine was mine, but then was mine no more. That's identity. One might read that as being about identity and then losing identity, and then seeing off these incredible ships. To be waving off, something magnificent, something incredible, something beautiful to look at. It's sailing off into the ocean. It's gone. If it's seeing off the incredible ships, that means it's not on the ships. That means that this person who's lost their look, their identity, they're left behind in a way, and they're saying goodbye to something. They're watching something leave them. Whatever the ships might represent, they represent that. Whatever they represent in any sort of concrete, direct way, that is, if we read this as a epitaph for somebody who's lost their identity in the death of the American dream, then the ships might be aligned with whatever the American dream represented, that is fleeing, that is leaving, and leaving this person behind, leaving this stripped away person on the shore. But I defend myself with this look that pours from the waves where dawn dares go. I, armless poet, lost in the vomiting crowd, without an effusive horse to cut the dense moss from my temples. Uh, so we have I, the armless poet, lost in the vomiting crowd. We can sort of read this as now Lorca, and the first person wandering through the crowd in this sort of nightmarish Coney Island land where people are vomiting up their money, if you will. And then we have this image of the dense moss on my temples. That comes up elsewhere in his poetry, where he's talking about the moss on his temples. Let's see. But if at night, so this is in the third one of these poems, City Without Sleep. This image comes up again. But if at night someone has an excess of moss on his temples, then open the trapdoors so the moon lets him see the false cups, the poison in the skull of his theaters. So there's different ways to read this image of the moss on temples, on a person's head. If a plant is growing on somebody's head, that probably means that person is kind of dead, or if not dead, they've at least been immobile. But moss, a plant, is life nonetheless. So it's kind of life coming from death in a way. That might be one way to read it. And I had that reading. The thing about that, the idea of kind of a rebirth, of a perpetuation of life through death, that might not be apparent just from this, and you might read that differently. But I think when aligned with the other poems, that becomes much more arguable, much more defendable when you get other images of kind of rebirth. Not just the repeat of that same image in a different context, but like here, some other day we'll see the resurrection of mounted butterflies. So that's resurrection is essentially rebirth of mounted butterflies. And just a passing thought on that, of resurrection, mounted, you might find in that almost an allusion to Christ. Mounted being analogous to crucifixion. That's one possible reading, but at any rate, it's about rebirth. And even as we wander through a landscape of gray sponges and mute ships, so we also continue on with the image of the ships, but the quiet ships, the ships are not speaking. That is everything that was held valuable, everything that the speaker, being the poet, let's say, but I don't think it's limited to Lorca alone, but the ships, the beliefs, everything is gone. But nonetheless, we'll see our ring glow and roses pour forth from our tongue. So that's a very, even in these scenes of death, these nightmare scenes of death, there's nonetheless these other images of life springing forth, which is both frightening and beautiful at the same time, really. I mean, it's at once sort of hopeful in that life will perpetuate itself, but it's also life coming from gruesome death and desecration, where let's say even the spending of money is equated to a vile function of the body, of revulsion, of rejected stomach contents, shall we say. But the fat woman continued in front, so the dream I don't say the dream because the fat woman has been opposed to the dream. The fat woman might be read as kind of the better than equating the fat woman to the American dream. We can equate that figure to a sort of offshoot of as a an illusory aspect of the dream of what is possible, the sort of extreme fulfillment of it, the grotesque. Uh, it's a grotesque version of the dream, we might say, of if you want to boil it down to the overly simple, economic symbols, then you can sort of say that that's what happens in unbridled capitalism. Bearing in mind that Lorca was a socialist, so he would feel along these lines. He's pretty anti-capitalist. So it's a grotesquerie that arises from gluttonization within the dream, of taking too much from the possibilities, taking so much from within the opportunities that the dream creates that it obliterates the possibilities of other people fulfilling that dream. So other people are there's these images of hunger, of starvation, of graveyards, and then still the fat woman persists on, the grotesque illusion of the dream. And the people looked for pharmacies where the bitter tropic is. Only when they raised the flag and the first dogs arrived, the entire city rushed to the boardwalk's railings. So we sort of end on this kind of a cynical note that people are still coming to the boardwalks railings, to Coney Island, basically to the fun land, but they're basically going there in the midst of death and decay and moral revulsion, basically. So again, trying to keep this brief. Again, this isn't a lecture. It's just a very, very quick, casual commentary. This is not meant to be a comprehensive analysis. Again, so I just want to quickly turn to Langston Hughes, Let America Be America Again, and just look at one very small passage. This one right here. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker, sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today, despite the dream. Beaten yet today, oh pioneers, I am the man who never got ahead. The poorest worker bartered through the years. So there's this very nice repetition here. Again, the thing with Langston Hughes is his language is always going to be very musical. He's considered kind of a jazz poet, so every word he writes is sort of infused with music. And the construction of his language is as important as the imagery that he's putting forth. Again, I want to emphasize that on one level, Langston Hughes, in comparison to, say, Lorca, seems very simple. He's not simple. He's just different. I think he's deceptively simple. I think that sometimes his language seems very straightforward, but he's actually saying there's a lot hiding within what seems like very boiled down language, even almost unpoetic language. There's metaphors hiding within concrete speech. There's symbols hiding within words that seem to be signifying directly. Sometimes that is not the case. When you start to pick the words apart, they open up a little bit. But what I want to look at here is just kind of the form, the technique of repetition, which in many ways is musical in and of itself. It's a poetic device in and of itself. It creates a rhythm. But there's something else going on here that might not be immediately apparent. And it's helpful to know a couple things. And the first clue is this: "O pioneers." Now, if you are brushed up on your Whitman, this might set off a trigger in your head, and this might seem kind of familiar, especially against this, which will be the kind of second trigger. So when you see that, then you might go back to this. This sort of democratic laying claim to a multiplicity of identities is very Whitman. So everything about this passage, it's pretty much an allusion to Walt Whitman. So if you look here, we have a poem called Pioneers, O Pioneers, right? So that's not an accident, that's not a coincidence. Langston Hughes was familiar with Walt Whitman. And we have here a great example of intertextuality where two different poems are speaking to each other. So we have intertextuality within the different Lorca poems, say, where those different poems speak to each other. We have intertextuality within the different Langston Hughes poems, where these poems, this one and say the Harlem poem that we looked at, and the poem Dreams, and some other poems, they all kind of speak to each other, but they're also speaking to poems by other poets, like Walt Whitman. So if you read Whitman and a lot of his poems, but especially Song of Myself, he will go through these lists where he's sort of saying, here, let's see if we can just. So Whitman is sort of, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. So that's the starting of this very long poem. But then he will go through. See, for here, for example, I am the mate and companion of all people. Let's see if we can get a better example. So we have with Whitman sort of, I go with the team also. He's sort of putting himself in these different. It's a very long poem, so I'm not going to read all of it, but he's going through. He's sort of flying through these different identities. I see in them and myself the same old law. So he's seeing himself inside of others. He's inserting himself into a vast array of identities. He's democratizing his own identity and sort of spreading it out through different places. So here you can see it again. I am of young and old, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of others, ever regardful of others, maternal as well as paternal, a child as well as a man. So he's sort of identifying with all of these different things. A southerner, soon as a northerner, a planter, nonchalant and hospitable, down by the Okanee I live. So you can see it's Langston Hughes is not. Langston Hughes is very aware of that. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Uh, he's not quite as, he's not laying claim to the rich and the old. He's mostly inserting himself into a certain sector of society, but it's still very Whitman-esque to dissipate his own identity among these different sort of uh, sectors. So we have images here of kind of the downtrodden of society, but he's still relating himself to a lot of people, and the Pioneers firmly puts it into Whitman territory. And as we talked about with the Song for Occupations, Langston Hughes is sort of dredging up this. He's calling he's taking to task and raising this challenge to the democracy, the American democracy that is celebrated and dreamed of by Walt Whitman. This democracy of where all are included. But obviously, Langston Hughes in this poem is pointing out all of the downtrodden, all of those who are not included. That's why it's important to, when considering Whitman and the Whitman is not so much identifying in society an equality of opportunity. He would certainly be for an equality of opportunity, or at least his poetry would be for an equality of opportunity. But he's really praising the equality of experience, the shared wealth of experience. So that's not in a material sense, but that all have an equal share in life. The poor as much as the rich. The poor are deprived in many ways, and in a social sense, they are deprived. They're downtrodden. They're treated unjustly, but that doesn't mean that they share in existence any less. That they are not part of the experience of the world any less. They lay as much claim to that. But Whitman, or Langston Hughes, is sort of bringing that back down to earth in many ways, arguably, especially with a passage like this, and sort of saying, well, that sort of has never really come to fruition. America never was America to me. So this dream of the democratic ideal, this dream that's kind of to use Whitman as our guidepost, that great flourishing democracy. When you bring it back down to a realistic level, outside of that kind of metaphysical sense of equality of existence, and just the equality of actual opportunity, the equality of opportunity that's promised by the American dream. It never existed for these voices that Langston Hughes is occupying and letting speak through him, and that he is in turn speaking through. The young man full of strength and hope, tangled in an ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land. Of the red man driven out from the land, the immigrant clutching the hope I seek. For all of these people, he's sort of saying that the American dream or the illusion of America was never a reality. It never truly offered the sure, maybe it recognizes the quality of experience, but it doesn't improve that experience per se for everyone. It deprives many and leaves many oppressed, basically. So again, that's just kind of a very quick commentary, and it went on longer than I intended. Um, but there's so much to explore in these poems, and that is not even scratching the surface. It's just to get some dialogue started. So I hope that it does stimulate some thoughts in your mind, and that uh, you will have some responses for class later today when you'll be watching this, I assume, as I'm making it late at night. But yeah, I will talk to you all in class in a while. I hope you get a chance to watch at least a little bit of this, and it gives you some ideas.